Cool. So I'm just going to start recording. So we'll start with Ian's image here, which I don't have all that much to say about. I think overall it has a really gamey sort of feel to it, which is nice, but maybe not as photorealistic as it could be. Um, I think the main reason for that is just the structures and the sort of saturation of the world. It feels very much like a um, Far Cry or Crisis style environment, which again, like I don't really have a criticism on that because it's a stylistic approach that he might have gone with. This sky is super interesting and really dramatic, which kind of plays again to that gamey feel because games are always very over the top about their theatrics. Um, but uh, like again, I wouldn't change the sky, but it does look like the sky. I've only got a low res version of the image here, but it looks like the sky has a little bit of sort of low quality JPEG artifacting. You've got kind of not all that great range in the colors. So that was the first thing that I noticed when I first saw the image. Was that quality of the sky. So potentially to make it more photographic, more matte painting like, we could have found a less dramatic sky that was higher quality. I would say in the background here, these mountains have a little bit of, let me just push this out, a mismatch to the sky behind them. I would say that the shadow edge is a bit too dark. The highlights are okay. They might be a little bit too bright because of the distance that those mountains are. But definitely, there's a sort of mismatch between the luminance of the sky and the environment. And you got to remember that when you're lighting or when you're figuring out the brightness of a background element, you want to understand that it's getting lit from the sky. So it needs to sort of match the intensity, especially as you go back into the distance. There's a really good example from the MattePaint Academy where I do deconstructing light, and I'm just going to find the screenshot of that because the image that I used is a really good example. So here. So here's the finished product of that image. So a little crop of it. So just ignore that little thing. But you can see here that the mountains, they're all the same, really. They've got the same plants, the same grass, this virtually the same geographical structure, but they fade into the skylight as you go into the distance. So this is the sort of thing that I'm referring to in that background. That's actually something that could be and probably is adding to that gamey kind of that gamey feel of the background, because games will typically have a 3D environment and then behind that we have like a skybox. So sometimes it's not always possible for them to make sure the blend points look really really good. Okay, so let's have a look. I'd say also some of the edges through here could have been improved, but I know that Ian is very aware of the style. Like he's a junior matte painter. He knows what's needed and what can be done. I think he posted this within like 3 hours of us uploading this image.
It was really quick.
It was really quick. So I can see why there's some errors in here. Things like this. So see how the edge of this bush is just very harsh, whereas over here we have some sort of breakup in the alpha. What you can do to get this, and I'll probably cover it once I start playing around with the image pack, but you can just sort of randomly speckle the edge out to give it more of this kind of texture through here. You do want to be careful of floating elements like this. And to be fair, that this floating element might not be as floating in his original higher resolution. It just when you downsample, you lose some pixels. So I think with the foreground plate, there's nothing wrong with it. As far as I can see here, it's all been cut out really nicely. It's graded. He's matched the lighting. Potentially, we have slightly harsher light through here than we do on this background. We can see that these hot hits and these harsh shadow edges, even though there's sort of these thatching leaves, it's breaking up the shadow, but we can see that overall it feels like quite a harsh edge. You can see it there. So you might end up having actually a little bit more of a ping on some of these layers. Like I can quickly show you. Let's go like this. Actually do that. Yeah. So you might have a bit of hot hits like this down certain edges, especially those that are clearly facing the sunlight. And of course, you do have to consider that it's further in the background, so these highlights will be muted to some extent.
Actually looks like a dragon.
It does a bit, and that's another thing that's sort of pulling it down in terms of realism, because we know, the human eye knows that this kind of shape is not very likely to exist. Although that said, it is based on photography. He's taken a photograph here, so we could be completely wrong. There are some things that occur in
that actually exists.
Yeah, and there are some things that occur in nature that when you create a matte painting with them, the human eye goes, nah, that's not realistic. Just look at mammatus clouds. Like they're an excellent example. For those who don't know what mammatus clouds look like, I'll get a screenshot. If somebody showed this in a matte painting, you would just say, no, that's not real. So there are certain things, and this has been said quite a number of times in visual effects by like supervisors and reviewers, that it's not about whether it was realistic or not. It's about whether the audience thinks it's realistic. So putting mammatus clouds into a shot where, say for a superhero movie, it just doesn't make any sense. But if you do it, if you're adding them in a shot for, say, a weather apocalypse, something like tornado or the day after tomorrow, where you've got this like weather events as the central theme, then people are going to feel like, okay, they've done their research, and that's what that's what this would look like. So you can see there that just with a bit of painting of light, it's probably a bit over the top, but we can just fade this back a little bit just to sort of help with that harder edge of light, to indicate that it's actually been directly lit. And then we can also add in something like, if we go screen and pick like this color, let's go, these sort of off camera effects can be really good for just indicating a bit of extra sort of atmosphere. That said, I would recommend being very subtle on them, because in a visual effects sense, you wouldn't be adding that kind of thing, because that would be part of the compositor's job, because we'd have a moving camera through the scene. So with that, this kind of effect would need to be animated depending on where the camera is looking. All right, so let's go to the next one. I'm just gonna.
I think he got mad with you.
Say again.
Yeah, I think he got me. Oh, he's back. He's back.
Who's back? Oh, the video's back.
Ian.
Oh, Ian. All right. Oh, wow. A lot of people have joined.
You feel the pressure now.
Yeah. So, okay. And last month I just saw your image, so I'm going to grab that as well. Let's do that.
Well, I gotta go. It's too late for me. Thanks for the
Cool,
session.
man.
See you guys tomorrow. Bye.
Thanks for joining. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Okay.
Bye.
So here we go. Let's have a look at this one, which I think is... sorry, whose submission was this? Is this yours, Mike? No, okay. Just let me find out who this was so I can review it. There's so many similar submissions. It's hard to actually filter through them. Okay, here we go. This is Alex. Alex's submission. So the main thing I think here is that there's no clear indication of where our light source is coming from, except for the sort of bright spot in the sky. But we have some conflicting. So we've got this here, but then we've also got really bright spots over here, which indicate that there's maybe a sun illumination source that's close to these clouds that are really blowing it out. Also, with this type of cloud, this kind of cirrus cloud, the way that the sun would react through these areas would be far less uniform. So if we had a sun, say, let's actually pick this area here as our sunspot. If it was there, we would have this kind of intensity would continue to around this distance, and then out here we would have a much less intense glow. So this kind of makes it feel like we're on an alien planet where we have a sun that's like that big, and it's just the sun's setting, and we've just got this completely blasted sky. So try and just tone in that sort of intensity through your sky. And then with the foreground, we have these sort of shadow edges here that are indicating again that we've got a somewhat directly lit scene, but there's no indication of where the light source is, and we also have a very cloudy sky. So same over here, we've got very harsh, sharp shadows here that are casting. The whole rooftop here is in light. We've got hard shadows in the background. Those sorts of things will drive the kind of sky that you can use. And quite often that's why when you're locked to a plate like this, you want to find the sky that matches for what you want to do. But it has to match the lighting of the plate. If you're not locked to a plate, like you didn't have to use this exact image and maybe there was another one that had more ambient or overcast lighting, then you would have more flexibility because you can choose between the two and you can make a combination of whatever you want. But in this case, just replacing the sky and making sure that you match the direction of the sun, that will make it a lot better. In terms of figuring out what direction the sky is coming from, it does take a bit of experience, but it also takes a bit of time to really look at the image and decide, okay, where is our light source coming from? In here, I can see that we have this shadow down here that is being cast from something, and it seems like it's being cast from this corner onto the surface. But we have to verify that with something else because it could be coming from somewhere else. So here we can see this overhang is clearly caused by that roof. So we know that our sun now is like pretty high up in the sky. Same with here, that's more verification that our sun's quite high. And then here, this is what really is the key indicator here. We have this top edge, and so these two here, it looks like this is probably casting to that point because we've got a bend in the shadow. And then this one would just be casting somewhere down onto this overhang. So from that, we can then go, okay, well, our sun is sort of, in this direction, coming from the top left, but also slightly front lit because so much of this is not in shadow. So that gives you an indication of where your sun goes. It's something that takes a bit of experience, but the more you look at it, the better you'll get. So the other thing, there's two other things that bother me about this, and one is just the general shadows. So if you zoom out of your image, you can see, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to screenshot this at a really low res and then paste it in and just like, let's do, because viewing your image at a thumbnail size is a great way of figuring out like how do the pixels feel at a glance. So also blurring it can help a lot.
That's what for?
So this is to figure out whether your composition makes sense, or whether your composition has any interest. So notice here that the eye, it feels like we're looking through the water at this, and your eye sinks into this area here of darkness because there's not much else in terms of contrast and interest in the rest of the image. I shared with the Discord server yesterday, I think it was, and I'm going to see if I can find it again because there was a really great example. Yeah, here it is. So it was Adrian Poblet who shared this image here. So he shared this sort of work in progress, and I had the same issue with this left-hand piece. And if you zoom out and you look at that from a smaller resolution, your eye kind of sees these three main blobs of light and dark. If we then take this image, which I just literally went to ArtStation and just clicked on the first image that I saw that had like an environment on their main page. So here, if I was to zoom out, you can see that even I hope the stream is like showing it because it might be compressing it, but you can see that we've got some formations in the background here that are contrasted. We can still tell what the whole scene is conveying. We even had this nice contrasted element that's kind of creeping out in the foreground. And the image as a whole, even if I blur it, it still retains its structure and its interest. And you can see here that the eye is just drawn straight into that background point. So that's what we're looking for, is to just draw the eye into a particular area. And one of the cliche ways to do that is to just cast a big, pool of light in here, like this artist has done, is just put a bit of a hit of direct light down there. So going back to this one here, I find myself looking at this area because it's so deeply in shadow. And that's not to say it wouldn't have been in shadow, because he's indicated that there's a big mountain on the left here. But just compositionally speaking, it draws the eye a bit too much. So the last thing I'll mention is the color of these mountains in the background. If we had like this, just a bit too much purple for the amount of orange and red that we have in our sky and our foreground. So if I just do a color balance directly on this and just pull out some of that purple, we might actually have to go into the shadows to pull it out of that value there. And we also have to tint it more towards the yellow and red, because we've got yellows and reds in the sky and the ground. So let's have a look. Sometimes color balance isn't always the best option for this. Right. Yeah, so that, just generally speaking, you can see the before and after. There was just way too much purple spill on that on that mountain, and this still isn't entirely matching with the sky, but there are some other things that we could do to improve that. Cool. So this one I think is Mike's. So this overall piece feels like a bit of an HDRI shot. It feels like we've kind of done a tone map to really brighten up some of the shadows. In fact,
Hey guys.
Yeah, hey.
I'm back. Conrad, just a quick question. Did I win?
That's all you care about, isn't it? Did I win?
Yes.
Like I said, when you wake up in the morning, you'll know.
Oh God. Okay. Bye.
You'll know whether you won or not.
Jesus. Goodbye.
Goodbye, Diego.
See ya. So through here, I can see you've got some areas of like black haloing, and I think that's probably because what you've done is created an adjustment layer and you've brightened the shadows, but your mask doesn't entirely, reach this edge here. But let's have a look. I can show you how I would improve that. Just give me a quick second. Okay, so if you do end up with these sorts of artifactings, you can come in and create a new layer, and you can, if the pixels that you want to affect are ones that you want to brighten versus around like their surroundings, then you want to choose the darker color, I believe, if I'm remembering this correct. Yeah. And then what we do is we just use a clone stamp tool, and we'll select the background here, and just wait. No, it's lighter color. You can it's either lighter color or darker color. So when you start to do this sort of process, if you've got it wrong, just change it to the other blending mode. So you can see here that I can clone stamp this background, but if I paint over the top of this, notice how it doesn't do anything, and that's because of the lighter color blending mode. So I can be a little bit more rough with where I'm painting because I've got that blending mode. If I set this back to normal, you can see that I've got an issue here painting over things. So this just makes it a little bit easier to go through and fix up these kinds of edges. And it's actually, I find it a lot of fun because it's such a simple process that you can go through, which at the end of that process will make the whole image look really like a lot better than it did previously. You'll find these sorts of issues mostly around the edges of mountains, where you've cut out a sky and you've got like a remnant blue sort of rim around your mountain. So overall, I think the composition works pretty well. You do have a little bit of a mismatch in your perspective lines. So here, if we have a look, our sort of perspective is going like that, right? So we've sort of got a point off screen over here, and then here, I mean, these don't really help because while they might actually match up in terms of perspective, because they're on a different angle, it's a little bit hard to tell whether they do match. But it seems like this ground point goes kind of like that. So notice how if these were matching this, even at a different rotation, they wouldn't quite converge at this point here. They would converge well off in the distance. So this indicates that these buildings were photographed at a much closer position with a wider lens potentially than these ones. Then with the mountains, I would say that the mountains feel okay, but it does feel like we might actually be like sort of looking at a different angle to some of them. I'm not really too sure what's going on. The only thing I would recommend is when you do line up your images, try and take all of the horizon lines and put them all on the same spot. And then what you do is then scale the images up from that position. And then again, similar to the previous submission with the composition, you've got a couple of areas which are pulling focus, and namely it's this area here on the right. And then this eye sort of, for me at least, the eye sort of travels over to here, and I think you've almost got it over here, but your foreground contrast is not high enough to sort of stand out against the background. So if we were to let's go through, and I'll just quickly do a mask of this building. And so a good way of testing this for yourself is put the image into black and white, and then if you notice the nice stepping into the distance, you should notice any major depth changes, like from a village to the background mountains. You should see quite a difference in the contrast, and that's why you also want to have layering involved, because otherwise you just have this foreground and then some background mountain, and it doesn't really have enough interest. So actually I'll create a curves layer with that mask, and let's just darken that. So see how that immediately pulls the eye over to the left when we look at that versus that. We've got a nicer contrast for the eye to relax and look into that area. And then even if I was just to quickly brush it over here, it might also help these ones.
Okay. Can you not hear me at all?
No, I can hear you now.
Oh, now you can hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Just trying to get it to work. I'm alive.
Okay. Yay. So another thing you can do with these, and I would try and steer away from this technique, but if you really were sold on having these mountains in the background and only these sort of two layers, then just washing over behind the village. So I'm going to invert that mask, and then I'll just let's go. Just do something like that. There. Sometimes these, like I've got to say, when I was working with Damien Thaler, he was the supervisor matte painter at most of the studios that I've worked at, because I enjoyed working with him so much, and that whenever he went to a new studio, I'd just go with him. I would watch him working, and he was one of the fastest matte painters I've ever seen, but he used a mouse most of the time. And he would do these masks that were so accurate with a mouse, and he'd draw around this, and like I can't do it. It's just I find it like trying to paint with a brick. And then once he'd created the mask, he would do something like this, where he'd just come in and go, and he'd undo it, and he'd do it again, and he'd undo it, and he would do that for a good five minutes before he found a brushstroke that he liked. Maybe he would change the warping on the brush, and he'd try it again, or he'd try a different brush, and so he was technically very slow, but he arrived at the final result so much faster than other matte painters. So I mention that because sometimes you will spend 10 minutes just trying to find the correct look for a layer between your foreground and background. Maybe you even spend an hour. I remember on just late last year, I was doing a matte painting for a client, and I was trying to work out this position of this village on a hillside, and after about 2 hours, I just deleted it because it just wasn't working. So it's just something. It's just like food for thought. That matte painting is a slow process for the most part. The quicker you do a matte painting, the closer it's going to end up being like a concept art piece. So yeah, you can see here that if I was to group those and turn them off and on, see how much more depth we have in the image because we've got our contrast ratios in the foreground correct, or at least better. If I turn this as a black and white filter, here you can see we've got kind of the same highlights and shadow values as a lot of our shadow and highlight values in the foreground. Same back here, there's kind of no real change in the depth. If I turn these adjustments on, you can see there's a really nice change in the depth. Our eye has places to go in terms of distant and close objects. And the last thing I would say on this one is that the way that you've done the light here would make sense sometimes. Like if you've got a metal plate, let's say that this is corrugated iron, which it probably is, because that's corrugated iron. So this would probably have an element of bloom to it, which is what you've got here. See how the light is sort of spilling out over this left hand side of the building. So we've got sort of this bloom through here that's being very much created by a spot around there. So that would happen, but it would be far more controlled. So let's see if I can find another example, or I can just use. Let's say I'll try it on this piece here. So if we were to do a lighting effect like that, I use a color dodge layer filled with black. So color dodge. When you paint black into a color dodge layer, it does nothing. So that's why I'll start with a fully black color dodge layer, and then you can paint inside that. So, but it has a very strong effect. So you can see here, like if we say that this is being directly lit from something, like a sunlight, we can make it ping in a similar way to over there. But then the actual spill from this light over to the nearby objects would be more like, let's see how we can do it. It would be more like doing this. Let's duplicate it, and then just halve the effect of each of them. So now I've got two layers that are adding up on top of each other, and on the top layer, and there's tons of ways that we can do this, but on the top layer, I'm just going to blur out this edge ever so slightly. Actually, I'll just use a Gaussian blur for that. And we can probably increase that a bit. So you would get just ever so slight amounts of bloom around that object. And then if you wanted to, say, have a lens spot, then you could do something which is a little bit more sort of broad stroke, like, a couple of brush strokes in that area. Just generally speaking, when trying to paint light, it's use this black layer with color dodge as a starting point, because it gets that. The fall off is just a lot more accurate. There are a lot of other techniques for painting light, and especially depends on the characteristic of the light, whether it's coming from the sun or the moon or an incandescent bulb, that kind of thing. Yeah, so just have a look at that. You've got probably a little bit too much on the plants and the ground here as well. So I might just leave this for you, Mike, in case you want those layers to play around with later. So the last one is from Lasma. I think this is extremely successful. I really dig the overall feel. I love the way the sun is coming through here. It's actually pretty damn accurate the way that you've integrated the sun. We could have ever so slight more amounts of what's called light wrap. So that would be like we're talking about kind of random bits of intensity change from the sun, which is then eating into and sort of creating that like a mirage, almost a mirage effect. But you'd want to have it be a little bit of a softness. So, and I suspect you've already done a little bit of this kind of effect to this image, because it looks pretty well done. And this is how you can really make it convincing. Of course, when it comes to a matte painting, if you were to do this in a visual effects environment, you would probably not do this kind of effect. You would give this layer to the compositor, and the compositor would then do the light wrap effect inside of Nuke. So we're talking about, I've probably gone a little bit too far, because the center of the post here should probably be left alone. Should probably be, the original color. But here you can see, just by turning that on and off, let me just get rid of that bit. There's a little bit of a sort of warm glow wrapping around that edge, and the same thing would happen, through here. You get just ever so slight amounts of bleed. Now, don't go too far with it. It should be. I mean, again, it's, with so many things in art, it's an experience you have to just go through and practice. And yeah, so here we can see around this edge we have this artifacting. And to be clear, I suspect this is one image. I don't think Lasmo has taken a sun and added it to the sky, because it feels so integrated already. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but these dark edges are actually photographic artifacts that will exist in photography naturally. So sometimes we will have to make a choice as to whether or not we want to remove those. And generally speaking, if you were working in a visual effects environment, you would be required to, or you'd be asked to paint those artifacts out. So yeah, so it's the original sky. Let's see, why is that? So this is here. What we have is an issue with the brightness of this pixel is pretty much the same as here. So this lighter color effect might not work, but we could always just increase it so slightly and paint that in there. Actually, if we go lighten there. Yeah. So you'd want to just go through and make sure that you fix up these kinds of artifacts. Okay, so let's have a look at the rest of the image. Probably, photographically speaking, we have not quite enough contrast. So I can see obviously that you've graded the foreground plate to look like it's lit from the rear. But if we zoom in on this piece here, we can clearly see that there's a bit of a fall off in the shadow around that stick. So that's really just like, you can only push a plate around 20% in terms of grading before you potentially making it look unrealistic. Yep, that's a good point. We would definitely have a reflection through here. So it would probably be broken up, because we'd have a shadow from these stilts, and the top of this boat would all be casting sort of shadows like this. We'd have something like that, but they'd be very blurry by the time they got out here. So you just get this general sort of indication that there was some kind of shadow through here. But if you were to do a let's just take it as though the sun is just directly shining on this water. Again, we can go with our color dodge. Let's fill that with black, and then sample like a heat in the sky. And let's actually go like this. And let's say this is just one technique. So the color is wrong. The intensity is obviously wrong, but let's just get the color right. And saturation, as we change the saturation, it changes the effect as well. So, and we don't want to change brightness because that'll change our black values. Now from here, if we double click on the layer, and this is a really quick way to do this, we can use the blend if, and we want to go from the underlying layer and we just want to hit those highlights. And then by holding Alt, you can separate these chevrons again. So we just want to get to sort of a midpoint, hold Alt and separate those. Let's go like that. Right, and then, so we don't want it over here, so we can just remove it with a mask. And then we can paint that back in. And if you want to increase the effect, we can duplicate it and we can just bring in a bit more. You can also change the saturation or the color of the second layer to be a bit more yellow, so you've got this fall off of the warmer tones. So then if you're wondering, I keep forgetting to cover this blend if mode, but if you've got a layer, because this blend if mode is set to the underlying layer, so it's taking the values of the underlying layer and deciding where this top layer is going to go on top. But if I was to take an adjustment layer and I change the underlying grade, that top layer is completely gone because we've changed what's underneath it. And if I go the other way, it's going to change again, just in the opposite direction. So sometimes you need to be able to bake this blend if layer to a layer to permanently say, no, these are the pixels I want you to be on. So to do that, all you have to do is just add a blank layer, or the quickest way to do it is to add a blank layer and just select the two and merge them. And then you'll need to go back to color dodge, and actually, yeah, in this case, there's a little bit of a difference because of the layer's now got a transparency. But what we'd need to do there is, that's how you would apply the blend if. But if you wanted to do that with a color dodge layer, the better way to paint light in this fashion is to use a black layer and then clip layers on top of that, like this. So where's our color dodge? So instead of doing these layers like this with a baked layer on top of the black, we would then paint our light on this layer on top, which is clipped, and then we have that separated, so then we wouldn't run into that issue. So yeah, so there's a lot of exposure values that are not quite correct here, in terms of, say, our the roof here would probably be more sort of warm and brightly lit. The shadowed areas here, we would have some cast light coming through these, and really interacting with the underneath of these buildings. If I show you Christopher's cover work for the Cambodia pack, is actually a really good example, because he's paid attention to that underneath side of the buildings. So let me just find that. So yeah, here you can see that this kind of attention to detail is adding a hell of a lot to the image. If that was just all dark, values, you would just have this sort of stream of light on the background buildings and it wouldn't have much interest. The other thing that he's done through here is made sure that while we have a lot of crunchy edges and that, he's made sure that none of these posts feel like they're backlit or brightly lit. He's probably retextured a lot of them because you can see here wood grain that I very much doubt was in the original. Okay, so that's the kind of attention to detail that if you really wanted to take this and make it into a masterpiece, you could really dive into some of these areas. It would be time consuming, but because there's just so much detail in here. But you could even just do it with a couple of little areas to see how it looks. Yeah, Alex has asked about lights, and I do agree. If you had added, like this very much feels like a dead scene. So I talk about two types of storytelling, and that's active and passive storytelling. So passive storytelling is basically anything that's still and has been there for a long time. So this architectural element would be a passive part of the story. Probably even most of the boats through here would be passive because there's no one in them, there's no one doing anything. Even the sun is a part of the story in this case because it's so dramatic and it's so emotive. You're conveying a very strong emotion. We do have this character here, and this one here, and I'm guessing there's probably a few others, but they're not really. You don't see them in this image, so they would technically be considered active parts of the story. So an active part of a story would be things like, if we had some birds flying through the scene, if you have some smokestacks or lantern lights inside of one of the huts. So you want to add as little of that active story as you can to your images, because it's not technically what a matte painter would focus on, but you do want to add some of it because it helps to tie the whole scene together and give the scene some interest and some context and life. One thing that makes this image would make this image feel a lot better if you did have some lights, because it would feel more realistic. Because if no one lived here, there would be no lights. But if no one lived here, these buildings would also fall down pretty quickly. So lastly, I would say that this mountain here doesn't really work for the composition. It does help to frame and give context to where this village is joined, and it's not just randomly out in the open. But I think it's just very blobby in that it's quite an obvious, here I've put a mountain on the side of my composition to frame it. If you had something more like maybe something that was building up instead, that could give it a bit more interest. But you could have something that, say, let's go with something like that, and then just something that's rather than just a single element on the left. This is kind of like what you've done is kind of like the token tree in the foreground to frame things, or grass underneath the. We've got some grass coming up here to indicate that we're on some piece of land. So yeah, I would just revisit this idea and maybe make more of it in that background. Cool. So I think I've gone through everyone's submissions. If there's any others that I've missed, or you guys want me to look at anything else, just let me know. But I've gone for an hour already, but I'm just going to spend 15 minutes just playing around with the latest pack that we have, and seeing if there's something that I can come up with. Wait, just cool. Let's save that. Cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new document, and I'm going to create a artboard from it. So if I select that, it creates an artboard by changing from the move tool. And now I can grab a bunch of my images and just doing those off screen. Right. And I can drag them in here. So what I can do from here, now that I've done an artboard, just wait a minute for it to finish. All right, so now what I can do is I can just drag these out. And this is like a really great way of managing your reference. And actually I should, I'm going to undo all that. And I'm going to just resize them all. So there's a really handy toggle with the selection tool up in the top left. It's called auto select. So with that ticked, whatever immediate layer is next underneath your cursor will get selected. So that allows me to just quickly drag these sorts of things out, and I don't have to find the layer and select it, which is really handy for just quickly moving around layers like this. Cool. And then I'll generally turn that off because once you start painting, once you start doing something, it can be kind of annoying. So what I'd normally do with artboards, especially at the start, is I'd actually create a couple of them. So you can do this just by switching back to the artboard tool, and you can click these pluses. So these are creating multiple sort of canvases of 1920 by 1080. And now I can take my layers and quickly sort of place the ones that I find most interesting. And this way you can do your thumbnail work on sort of 4 different artboards. And notice here on the right that it's grouping them. So that makes it just so much easier when it comes to later when you decide, okay, I prefer this shot, or I like this composition. I see. Control Alt right click, Mike says, allows you to just select. So you can see on the right here, as I'm doing that, it's selecting. And another good tip is with the selection tool, if you right click anywhere in your canvas, it will show you the layers that exist underneath that pixel that you right clicked on. So this way, if I right click here, I can select that. I can right click, select, right click, select. And if you've got multiple multiple layers like this on the same point, if I right click here, I have all 3 layers here. So that's super handy if you've actually bothered to do some organization of your file. That allows you to right click and see the whole hierarchy of your document. So actually, I really like this one. So I'm just gonna scale that up. All right. So this is a point where if I was doing this to sort of figure out a new composition, I would actually create a black and white filter over the top of everything. You can do that outside of the artboard, which means that it'll apply to all of the boards. And this way, you're sort of removing all of the color issues, because if I take, say, this image and I put it in here like that, and I want to see try and make that match. There's a lot of difference in the color and the lighting that can be quite distracting. Actually, could potentially do something like this. No, that would be too big. So yeah, so with that turned on, and now I can just look at these two elements and just concern myself with darkening and decreasing contrast, and just making making these two elements match. Actually, I might leave that quite high. There might be a bit too much difference between these two images to make them work. Does anyone have any other questions at this point? Because I'm just sort of toying around with the images now, so.
And when you're doing work like this, do you ever just stop to just study the image, look at the pixels, look at?
Yeah, I would say so. I generally try and find an image that that's going to work before I find an idea first. And everyone has their own way, I think, of finding what's interesting or what's going to work for them. Some people are good at sketching. I'm not a 2D artist at all, so I won't do that. But yeah, I will generally just find the idea first, and then once I have an idea, I find it much easier than to go and find the photography that will match the environment or match the idea. So I'm just having a look now on the MattePaint site for a sky image, and I'm just doing that on a different monitor. So let's throw this one in here. Yeah. So when you're positioning elements like this, you want to keep this horizon close to the other the horizon in your other image. So like that. And then if I want to change the content in here, I have to scale it from that position. If I make this down like here, you can see that this just doesn't look right. You can move it within a certain amount, like about, again, 20% I go with as a rule of thumb. So let's just go with like that. And this is why actually having higher resolution images can be so handy, because you can scale them a lot more than you otherwise might be able to. Okay, so now we have some grading to do. Alex has asked, what's the right way to change from 8 to 16? So what you want to do with working in 16-bit is, as soon as you create a document, and if, in fact, really your default should be 16-bit when creating a document, but if you change that value at any time, if you've only been using JPEGs, if you change that value at any time before you make any permanent changes to the colors or brightness of your images, then it's fine. For instance, if I was to grab the sky layer, which is just a JPEG, it's not a smart object like these other ones, and if I change this, the curve, and I brighten that, that's now permanently changed the image. But if I added a curves layer, adjustment layer, and I brighten that, if I then change the bit depth from 8 to 16, this curve is getting applied to that image after that change. So it's far less destructive to use the adjustment layers, but so long as you change to 16-bit mode, you should just do it as early as possible when it comes to your work. So I'm actually going to see if I can tint this image to a more purple. The color balance. All right, and let's do the same with this. So there'll be some additional integration through here. We've got to change the way that the light is interacting around here with the light wrap. So remembering that your ground plate gets the color from the sky. So that's what you're trying to match. And especially, it's really nice to have a ground like this, because it's such a plain color. We know what color it is. It's kind of like a dark gray or medium gray, grayish brown. So it's going to reflect the sky pretty heavily. Whereas, say, our greens, our grasses and our trees are always going to be green. They'll just be tinted a slightly different green. So that seems all right. Oops. So normally I would actually be going through, I would probably spend half an hour on each one of these. Once I got like 3 to 4 base images that I thought I liked, I'd spend half an hour in each, spend like 2 hours to figure out which one I liked the most. But for this demonstration, I don't want to I'm going to go for another 5 or so minutes. So, cool. So let's have a look through here. So with this edge, because I've done the blend if to start with, just to knock out the sky, I did that to just see what was going to fit in behind, see if it's good, and that's where I'll use this for the most part. Because once you actually go to create the proper mask, you want to remove that, and you want to jump in and really properly mask out that sky. So let's go like this. So I'm just going to use a quick wand. We'll often use different tools, but when you've got a nice gradient like this, it's a pretty good option. We could also use the object select tool. There's so many ways to make selections. All right. Again, when I'm going through the initial mask, I'm not too concerned about getting it perfect. It's more about just getting some kind of value in here to get it started. Then what we can do is we can go into, say, our channels, and we can look at if we disable that. Could be probably our red channel. And so if we duplicate our red channel here, so I'm just going to focus on this tree. So I select that area with our red channel. And if I press Control L to do the levels, what we can do is we can toy around with these things a fair bit. But what I'm going to do is first use these eyedroppers, and this will set the white and the black point. So if I click on this one here, I can click on this and say, make that pure white. And then on the black point, I'm going to select a darker, one of the darkest of the colors. And now that's set the black and the white points, and you can see them there. So I'm going to accept that and then do it again, because I just want to save that to the image so that I can go back in and potentially undo it. And then here we want to increase our contrast so that we're not getting crunchy edges like this. And here I can see that we've actually got some gray values there. So what I'm going to do is select that as my white point. And now it's we've lost a little bit of this area through here. So just back this off a bit. And this is really a sort of trial and error, a give and take kind of process. Now that we've got it almost there, we can use dodge and burn. So dodge will make the grays, it will push the grays further to white, and burn will push them more to black. So this is a great way to just fine tune those edges, because you can just paint in really lightly, and you can also come through to the range and you can say only affect shadows, which means that it's not going to affect these sort of middle grays there. And then same thing, if we go back to dodge, I can go only affect the highlights, and then I can sort of paint over. It is affecting some of the edges of those leaves though. Oh, okay. Well, next time I'll just stream the full desktop. Okay, so now with that selected like that, we can go back into our mask and we can paste that over the top. So now we've got a much nicer edge compared to previously. Oh wait, hang on. So there we go. So we've lost a little bit of those edges, but considering we've got a really bright element behind, that would be quite normal. And then what we can also do is, if you double click on your mask, it'll take you to the mask sort of refinement properties, and you've got these extra tools here. So if we just set it up to show our mask on layers, and actually we need to go back. Okay, so then we go to your view mode and go mask on layers, and that shows, basically it shows us the end result without seeing anything of the mask. And then we can come through to these tools here and we can paint over the areas that we want to refine. So if I paint through here, you might not see it through this edge, but if I go down this edge, you'll see very quickly that it's sort of resampling that edge and making it much less crunchy. And this is excellent for most things like trees, like palm trees, and you can see that sometimes it creates a bit of a ghost, but for the most part, that's actually matching. What's nice about it is it's matching the natural sort of sharpness of the content in the plate. So, oops. Let's just change that. So if I go through here, that's actually trying to bring back some of the scaffolding. There's also a couple of different refinements that we can do here, like shifting the edge and feathering. There's a few other tools through here, but I'm not going to cover them right now. We do have a video coming up for the Academy that will cover those things. So it kind of goes into an in-depth process of using this tool and exactly where you might use each brush. Anyway, so I think that's pretty much it for now. Like I could keep going and keep painting, but matte painting is a long process. You can't rush it. If anyone has any like final questions, just ping them through in the chat, or feel free to use your microphones. I can see that you've all got them. Yeah, so here you can see if I go, that's before and after, and that's just from using that refine brush tool. We'd have to come back through here and fix up some of the transparency though. Generally, I'll try and get as much. So Mike asked, do I paste only part of the mask at any moment? And that was referring to this tree. I will generally try and get as much done as possible with one broad stroke. The refine and mask tool is pretty good for that, in that you can come through and I can really broadly brush over this. And you can see that it's improved it somewhat, and I'm just really quickly like just bashing it over these areas that I think need some refinement, and the algorithm is just taking care of that. Then what you can do is just work with this to start with. Keep going, because sometimes you might actually find that maybe you replace this whole left-hand edge with another temple, and so there's no point in fussing over these alphas until you know that you're keeping that content. The other thing is that sometimes you just iterating over these things can nudge it further into looking good. And if you're ever at a point where you don't like that particular part, you can just you can just fill the mask back and just repeat that specific area, because you're not working destructively. So yeah, I would try and do broad strokes until the point that you get where you get to the point where you you know that you're 100% going to use that layer or that piece. Cool. Well, that's it, guys. Thanks for joining. I'm going to be doing a number of these each week. Probably one around this time, and then one around 12 hours different. So if you're up, if this is too late or too early for you, feel free to join the others.
Thanks a lot, Conrad.
Yeah, you're welcome, man.
Thanks. Good night.
Yeah. All right. Catch you guys later.
Thank you.